So I spent last week in Washington, D.C. and in Florida, and I always enjoy seeing my friends over on Capitol Hill. And during my time there, I spent a few hours talking to some people working in the Trump administration, because of course, even though appointments are still rolling, our guys are on the inside now. The administration has taken great care to root out members of the permanent bureaucracy, the faceless deep state that sought to frustrate the Trump agenda for the first time that he was in office, and this time with a whopping electoral mandate from the majority of Americans. It's undeniable that what Trump intends to do, including the mass deportation of not just violent criminals that were let in under the Biden administration, but all potentially 30 million illegals currently residing in the United States, working, breaking the law, and also just taking tens of billions every year in taxpayer dollars, to remove them from the country. That was something that was very popular, particularly among Gen Z voters when polled. And so it is alarming to hear that there are cuckoos in the nest, according to some people who are very on board with President Trump's agenda, but have found themselves running into walls by lobbyists who are pushing for amnesty and seeking to find loopholes or even outright block mass deportations. There was a Florida Republican congresswoman called Maria Elvira Salazar and Texas Democrat congresswoman Veronica Escobar who co-sponsored a bipartisan, uniparty, bill called the Dignity Act, which is just amnesty for illegal immigrants working on farms and in the service industry, and even creates a greater wiggle room for some criminals. Now, the reason that amnesty should never be an option is, one, California was turned into a permanent blue state when Ronald Reagan, much celebrated president for fighting and winning the Cold War on the Republican side of the aisle, granted amnesty to thousands of illegal Hispanics who then, through a process of family reunification, chain migration, brought in lots more of their illegal family members, had this massive build-up again of illegal migrants awaiting another amnesty, and all of those formerly illegal migrants who brought in more illegal migrants are going to vote along ethno-nepotistic lines, because that's in their self-interest, for permissive asylum systems promised by largely Democrat candidates who pander to sectarian ethnopolitics rather than discuss issues of the day like economics and tax policy. And so California flipped permanently blue. Another reason that they can't do this is because this is now the countrywide strategy by the Democrat Party to ethnically gerrymander the American electorate, stack certain states like California after the last census in America miscounted, stack that with extra electoral college seats because that's allocated according to state population, not necessarily legally registered voters, and to redistribute this share of illegal migrant electoral clients to purple, even red states. They want to try and make Florida and Texas blue states too, especially Arizona's electorate has been endangered in recent years. It's why, setting aside the fact they haven't picked very good candidates, they can't get it locked down, despite Arizona being on the front lines of the illegal migration crisis under the Biden administration, when at least 10 to 11 million people entered the country by breaking into the southern border, usually with the sponsorship of state-funded and foreign-funded NGOs facilitating their travel from all over the world. Now, the Trump administration, at least Trump himself and his closest allies, are not intending on an amnesty plan. They are not intending on supporting this Dignity Act. They do not want to give any quarter to squishiness on immigration. This is why Trump has shared a series of posts, including by Orrin McIntyre, who is the podcaster's podcaster in many respects. Lots of Capitol Hill staff listen to him, saying there can be no asylum and amnesty plan because you ran on the promise of mass deportations. And this is why a Trump administration official came out and listened to pressure from the base and said there will be no amnesty. Now, that is their intention, but I happen to have been relayed by reliable sources on Capitol Hill that, especially in the Department of Agriculture and some people in the Treasury, they are pushing for an amnesty bill This was why Trump floated it a little while ago, saying there are great people who might be undocumented in our service industry, in our farming industry, that maybe we can make some leeway for. They're concerned about this impact on the American economy. And especially going into the midterms, what an economic downturn that will be blamed on Trump's tariff and immigration policies will mean for the very slim majority they have in the House. Now, bear in mind, Trump's big, beautiful bill, the majority of which is a single-line spending item, was dedicated to expanding the capacity of ICE, expanding the deportation effort. You can hear Stephen Miller salivating about the prospect of rounding up every Home Depot employee in the background. All of this was just got over the line by a very slim majority because 3 Democrats were so old they died in office in the last year. If that had not been the case, if the Democrats were savvier, not so ideologically committed and morally corrupt as to have replaced their older congresspeople like Dianne Feinstein before they were literal corpses being shuffled round Congress with their staff voting on their behalf, see also Joe Biden, then they might have actually thwarted Trump's big, beautiful bill from going through the House, and on the name alone, it would have been a seismic defeat for the Trump administration. Not that a lot of the concessions made to get it over the line or attacks on Thomas Massie and Rand Paul were all that ennobling either. It's a shame, for example, that Planned Parenthood has only been defunded for 1 year rather than the Plan 10, and lots of the other abortion providers and abortion access items were not defunded. All of these sorts of concessions had to be made because the margin of victory was so slim, and so the Trump administration are really worried that they won't increase that margin of victory if there is an economic effect from deporting illegal farm workers. However, there's a few items on this. First of all, we know that even on these farms where cheap labor is being utilized, there are horrific abuses being committed. You see the recent ICE raid on the California weed farm, that crucial backbone of the American economy. There were children working there. Now, Gavin Newsom didn't want to address this. He was mainly too busy blaming ICE for being racist and draconian and fascist and whatever buzzword flows from his Patrick Bateman-esque face. Nobody wanted to address the question, why were there children working at a weed farm? Nope, okay. That's because during the Biden administration, as whistleblowers to the post-millennial and the like came out and said, thousands of children, unaccompanied minors who had crossed the border or minors who had crossed without their parents, were taken and they were put on flights on their own, flown to random areas of the country, disappeared into the system, never to be seen again. So they're either being trafficked, used as illegal migrant labor, or the absolute worst imaginable is happening to them, which I need not say aloud. And so it is very important to ensure that there is absolutely no profit motive for anyone to cross the southern border. Not least of all because it undermines and undercuts American workers. It means that you don't have the bargaining power as an American worker, especially in the age of automation and artificial intelligence, to demand that you be paid a decent wage in the age where successive governments have spent recklessly and inflated all of your savings to being pennies. If you have access to the entire world as a labor supply, then the American workers' bargaining power means absolutely nothing. Not only that, but this trade having an economic reason to continue means that thousands, possibly millions, of vulnerable children in South America and across the globe, because this is now a global trafficking network, are vulnerable to predation. And so it is a matter of the utmost importance that no amnesty deal gets done. The other side to this is legal migration. Now, I touch down in Washington dollars. I usually fly into Boston, enjoy the nostalgia of Boston Logan, feeling like I'm in a 1960s movie. My plane gets delayed, happens every time, and then connects to DC Reagan internally because it's much closer to the capital and where all my friends are. But instead, I flew into the headquarters of the Feds, which is Washington dollars. Thank you very much to TIMCAST for flying me out. You can actually watch my reappearance on TIMCAST, linked down in the description. Seems it had a positive response. But I landed in dollars and spent 2 hours in central Mogadishu. I mean, the passport control line. I thought I was in a refugee camp. What the hell are you guys doing? As I understand it, and again, this is coming from discussions I had with people that work in the administration, there are at least 12 countries on Trump's revived immigration red list, and those are Afghanistan, Chad, Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Myanmar, Haiti, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. Think of all the doctors and lawyers you're losing out on. Plus, there's a further 7 countries, Burundi, Cuba, Laos, Sierra Leone, Togo, Turkmenistan, and Venezuela, who have partial restrictions with selective exemptions for certain people coming on certain visas. As I understand it, other countries have been eyed for being placed on the immigration red list, the travel ban list. And they should well, because DC Dulles, it felt like I was wandering through a Middle Eastern bazaar. There was a procession of people in wheelchairs getting special assistance to go through the barriers. Every single one of them was in a hijab. Guys, do you not think that people are custodians of a culture and sort of ambassadors of a civilization and will recreate their civilization in your country? This is the sort of delusion of the liberal secular reading of the American founding. They think that religion is something that can be compartmentalized to the private sphere, and that public presentations of one's sincerely and deeply held convictions amount to exotic food and a funny looking costume that I wouldn't wear, but you do you, bro. Not the case. It turns out lots of religions and lots of foreign peoples, it rests like a dead hand on their conscience. It has a lot more meaning to show solidarity to one's ethnic and religious in-group, and religion and politics are not separate. There is no separation of powers. There is no secular public and religious private space. There is just an imperialistic desire to recreate the conditions of one's own country, or the hypothetical utopia that one's holy books, Quran and Hadiths, have promised to bring into fruition in your country. And that will absolutely happen if you continue this high volume of legal migration. Now, bear in mind, America has the same level of legal migration that the UK does. So we have 1 million every year, but we're the size of New York State. So it's much more pronounced here. So take it as a warning from a Brit, and I know lots of Americans are amenable to this because they see England falling like the motherland falling, and they feel a great sorrow that all of our history and accomplishments and heritage and architecture and people have been so badly mistreated by our treacherous governments and mercantile new arrivals who hate us and now jihadists number in the thousands, even millions in this country. Take it from Brit. Do not make the same mistakes that we have had to make, because we're not sure how to dig ourselves out of this hole, and we're trying to copy you. So, stop importing them. Very bad idea. Instead, and this is something that Wade Stotts has just done an excellent video essay on that I recommend everyone check out. You should just be watching Wade's content. He's sort of master of that particular art. If you're going to have a Pledge of Allegiance as a prerequisite to citizenship in a propositional nation, why don't you enforce the pledge? Now, I disagree that America is a propositional nation. It thinks of itself as a propositional nation, but that's only because all of the truths that were held to be self-evident by the Founding Fathers were self-evident because they were Christian Englishmen. And there was also Ben Franklin. But even he thought the Germans were a bit too dark in order to integrate. Like, there were actual serious concerns about the volume of German migration in the 18th and 19th century. And then, of course, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 19th century. And then the preference for Western Europeans, which, Ellis Island was even a bit shaky because there were Italians, Jews, Irish that showed up. And that wasn't a seamless transition. I mean, we got the mob movies out of it, but violent crime and poverty wasn't so great at the time. And even then, that was only about 15% of the population being first-generation foreign-born. I mean, that's really creeping up past that now in America. And they're from much more culturally distant lands, thanks to the 1965 Hart-Celler Act and the Anti-Defamation League and John F. Kennedy's myth that you are a nation of immigrants, rather than, as Samuel Huntington has observed, you're a nation of Puritan English settlers with a bit of Scotch-Irish and, some Catholicism thrown in. Don't persecute us too hard, guys, when the Christian nationalism Reich rises, I suppose. Point being, if you want to be a propositional nation, and at least pretend that you are, if you want to disconnect the Constitution and the Bill of Rights from the ethno-religious underpinnings that act as givens upon which it rests, it's not a smart idea. Actually, Joseph de Maistre has 4 rules of constitutional government that I'll reference. If you want to read a little bit more about this, I would recommend Orwell McIntyre's book, The Total State. But He writes, the fundamentals of political constitutions exist before all written laws. So the identification of a we, the people, before writing what they believe is the fundamental pre-political question. Identifying the demos for whom the democracy enacts the will of is important. Number two, that a constitutional law is and can only be the development or sanction of a pre-existent and unwritten right. Again, they're the pre-political sentiments of the men that are writing them that are then codified as law because they are self-evident to the people writing it, and if you change the people, then they're no longer self-evident. Three, that the most essential, the most intrinsically constitutional, and the really fundamental is not written, and even should not be if the state is not to be imperiled. So often, like in Britain, unwritten constitutions, which exists in the hearts and minds of the homogenous people for whom these things are self-evident, are better than written constitutions, because written constitutions kind of allow yourself to delude yourself into thinking that literally anyone from anywhere is exactly identical on a blank slate, and if you just bring them to America and they say the pledge, they are sufficiently signed up to it to be custodians of your civilization, rather than, just them putting their hands on a not Bible, walking out the door, and then electing themselves the Islamist mayor of Somalia, or Minneapolis, rather, and New York. Because that's what's actually happening. And number four, that the weakness and fragility of a constitution is in direct relationship to the number of written constitutional articles. So the more the law expands to replace the thick bonds of civic society that Alexis de Tocqueville observed when touring America, that he saw as the moral substrate that made America so peaceful and prosperous, and despite its vast landscape, a kind of spontaneous, high-trust order, capable of self-governance. All these things written in Christopher Caldwell's very good book, Revolt of the Elites, by the way. All observed as the sort of substitution of the old American order with the new multicultural managerial class democracy. If all of those things are thrown out because you change your population, you don't get to have a country or a constitution anymore. So, even if you're going to pretend that all of those things are disconnected from the homogeneous faith and heritage of the founders, even if they are just words on a bit of paper, at least enforce the words. This is Wade Stott's point. If someone says, they recite the Pledge of Allegiance, and they say, I'm committed to defending America against foreign enemies, I renounce all foreign loyalties, etc., and then they, run for mayor of New York while vowing to tax white people to redistribute money to black people, and have previously praised Hamas and whose staffers have supported global intifada, I might think they committed fraud on their naturalization forms. I might think that they didn't actually mean the pledge, and so you could strip them of their citizenship. That's something the Department of Justice are exploring. So this is a positive development from the Trump administration. So this was the memorandum that was released on the 11th of June 2025, and under the 5 priorities of the Department of Justice, they include combating discriminatory practices and policies, so enforcing civil rights laws. I'd rather you threw them out, because the Civil Rights Act is a kind of parallel constitution of positive rights layered on the negative constitution of negative rights. Two contrasting visions of liberalism here, even though they have the same fundamentally faulty anthropology, which is an unresolved contradiction. But we'll park that to one side and leave that to Patrick Deneen for today. I think it's wise to jettison the Civil Rights Act, and I've heard rumblings that the Department of Justice Community Relations Service being defunded and shut down is an early sign that parts of this will at least be repealed piecemeal. Getting rid of it all might be something for after the midterms, just suggesting. Number 2, ending anti-Semitism. Again, whether or not you think this should be a priority of the government, it should not shock you, because Trump's immediate family members are Jewish. He has supported efforts to fight anti-Semitism for a very long time. There's a famous clip of him talking about Ilhan Omar, the Right Honourable Member from Mogadishu, Congresswoman from Mogadishu, rather, who he just said, hates Jews. She is a bit obsessed with it, almost as much as her brother. So this is a priority for the Department of Justice. There was that very censorious bill that was proposed last year that would have made citing gospel verses about the Pharisees and Jews at the time of Christ in being involved in his crucifixion either illegal or able to have you be cancelled. by civil rights provisions if you're in a university or workplace or something. That is ill-advised. However, this is a priority for the Department of Justice, and I'm mentioning it at length because I'll come back to it in a second. Protecting women and children, very good. Again, why mass deportations need to happen. Ending sanctuary jurisdictions, so preventing cities from becoming and states from becoming sanctuary states, and defying the right of the federal government to ensure national security and border policy is upheld. I mean, every single legal immigrant is breaking the law. If you want to enforce the law, you have to get rid of every single legal immigrant. It doesn't matter how interpersonally nice they might be. They've broken the law. They need to go. Every last one. And the final one, which is why I'm mentioning this, is prioritizing denaturalization. Now, I'm just going to read this out. The Department of Justice may institute civil proceedings to revoke a person's United States citizenship if an individual either illegally procured naturalization or procured naturalization by concealment of a material fact or by willful misrepresentation. The benefits of civil denaturalization include the government's ability to revoke the citizenship of individuals who engaged in the commission of war crimes, extrajudicial killings, or other serious human rights abuses, to remove naturalized criminals, gang members, or indeed any individuals convicted of crimes who pose an ongoing threat to the United States, and to prevent convicted terrorists from returning to the US soil or traveling internationally on a US passport. At a fundamental level, it also supports the overall integrity of the naturalization program by ensuring that those who unlawfully procured citizenship, including those who obtained it through fraud or concealment of material information, do not maintain the benefits of the unlawful procurement. Basically, it restores value to citizenship by ensuring that the people that were granted citizenship, I think 8 million in the last decade, get a handle on that, guys, those people who have procured it under either fraudulent or insincere means, like not meaning the pledge, can have it repealed and they can be deported too, as Tom Homan famously said. Now, the reason I link the combating anti-Semitism one to this is because they're in the same memorandum. And it says in there that they may use civil proceedings to do this. So statutes that mean you might violate the Civil Rights Act, for example, they might bring that as a charge against you. And I think that would be... I mean, it may be the necessary legal mechanism because the Trump administration are tangled up in the sort of bramble thicket of decades of malign legislation that judicial activists from the bench and prior presidents via executive orders and Congress have instantiated into law, and they're just sort of trying to do their best with what they've inherited. But I think it would be a mistake to use the justification of, for example, anti-Semitism as the reason to strip naturalized citizens, new immigrants, of their citizenship. Instead, you should be self-confident enough to say they're enemies of the United States, especially if you're going to, again, pretend to be a propositional nation. If you disagree with the proposition, for example, if you're a communist, if you're a socialist, if you're an Islamist, things that Zoran Mandami is, then you shouldn't be here. You are working to undermine and dismantle the United States. As many of the people in these pro-Palestinian marches have said. This is why they kicked out that one student before who said he's committed to dismantling the West. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm probably not far off. So if this is the case, you should be doing that. You should be muscular enough about your national identity, your history, your proposition, and you should be linking that to the religious and historical underpinnings which justify it, by the way. It's sort of healthier to understand who you are in order to assert why it should be defended. You should be doing that rather than appealing to the rubric of who is the most marginalized in society, who's picking on them, we should outcast them. Again, I'm not saying anti-Semitism is a good thing. I've got Jewish friends, I don't want to see them mistreated. I work in politics. Shock, it happens. However, I'm saying it's not the motivator for defending your civilization. It's insufficient to call to arms, philosophically and democratically speaking, although the Second Amendment does allow you to do that in America, so, there you go. But to act as a rallying cry for all of the American patriots concerned about their country going down the drain. One final thing on that. It's all well and good stripping people of naturalized status. It's all well and good closing the borders to new immigrants and deporting illegals already there. However, you do have a pretty significant problem, and that is second-generation or third-generation immigrants who still lobby for divisive anti-white ethnopolitics and who call other countries their home. For example, the new Minneapolis mayoral representative, and this is Omar Fateh, who, along with other Somalians he is relying on as a voting constituency, calls Somalia his home. He was born in America. What do? It's like, okay, assimilation hasn't worked. Now what? It's an existential question that America has to examine and look at themselves. And it is a pure fact that if you keep demographically subsidizing these Islamic enclaves in Dearborn, Michigan, or Minneapolis, Little Mogadishu as they call it, or increasingly in Texas where they want to build a mega mosque now and a self-governing community, then you're going to give rise to democratically elected candidates who run on purely ethnic and Islamic sectarian tickets. And because heritage Americans vote along individualistic issue-based self-interest lines, they can't beat that clannish client politics. So you need to address the net inflow of that clannish clientele group from more countries than the one you currently have on the list. And this is a problem, again, told to me by someone working in the administration, the worry about expanding the list is kicking off conflicts overseas. For example, and this is a lesson for Britain, will our based world government, should they come into being in 2029, have the cojones to say no more immigration from India or Pakistan? Because the worry is that, one, existing Indian and Pakistani diasporas will start fighting in the streets, as was the concern when it looked like India and Pakistan were going to escalate into a hot war a few months ago. But also, would that then ignite, because the economies of the US or the UK are so intertwined with these countries, would that then ignite conflict between those countries over there, which could escalate to nuclear exchange because, well, given the rates of cousin marriage in those countries, impulse control isn't their strong point. This is a worry that visa restrictions and immigration prohibitions will impact diplomatic relations by the Trump administration, and this is hamstringing their ability to close the borders. Legal migration should be as much a priority as illegal migration, but international relations concerns is preventing them from enacting the agenda that a majority of the base want. So it's not just internal lobbying by the likes of formerly Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy over increasing H-1B visas to India because they watched Saved by the Bell once, or lobbying by the Department of Agriculture who want cheap foreign slave labor to continue picking their crops in the fields. I thought that debate was settled a few hundred years ago, but there you go. Or judicial activists who are blocking Trump's attempt to repeal birthright citizenship, which, you know, after Ketanji Brown Jackson was chewed out by Amy Coney Barrett for seemingly allowing her clerks to write her decision using ChatGPT, and the Supreme Court ruled that judges can't just intervene and defy executive orders by the president, especially like state level or district court judges. It's not just all of those things that are interfering with it. It is the administration themselves feeling cautious, concerned, that their actions as the global hegemon will kickstart conflicts in their ostensible vassal states. And this is a real concern because, as Trump has been very frustrated, playing daycare in the Middle East for nations that have not gotten on for thousands of years have been a real distraction from domestic concerns on the economy and on immigration. I'm not saying they haven't got things done. You know, Stephen Miller has undoubtedly dedicated a lot of attention after it was seen publicly that deportations weren't good enough to going around and targeting Home Depots, for example. I'm not saying that they're doing a bad job. I'm saying that if they had more resources, time, and attention that wasn't spent on foreign policy concerns, because loads of nations can't play nice, then they would be getting more done. And I'm worried that the foreign policy concerns themselves are preventing movement on the immigration front. So these are all lessons that we in the UK need to learn, and these are things that American commentators should be addressing about their own country. And I say this for two reasons. One, because I love America and I want to see it succeed. Like, I love visiting there. It was my wife's first time in Washington, D.C., and just going around all the museums and meeting our friends, and fantastic memories. It's a wonderful country. crazy. I mean, we got yelled at as we were walking out of Capitol Hill Starbucks by two NPCs who were on the sidewalk, as you say, screeching and filming, "Here come the white nationalists, here come the Nazis, here come the neoconservatives, here come the Christian nationalists." And I just thought they watched my show, you know. It turns out I wasn't recognised. They were protesting outside of a church. They hadn't really expected my English accent to come out when I asked them what was going on. And then when I said, "Do you normally just yell at strangers in the street?" Because we're not going in there. We were going to St. Joseph's on Capitol Hill, where we got a lecture on how the Good Samaritan means you have to accept infinity immigrants. It's apparently their right to seek economic opportunities in foreign lands, and wealthier nations have the obligation to admit them. And also they did a bidding prayer for the 1,300 traitors who lost their job at the State Department and left up posters saying, "Remember those left behind are fighting fascism." So it wasn't the greatest service. But anyway, these Capitol Hill protesters said, well, you look like you're going in, but maybe because you're tourists we'll give you a free pass. And then a transsexual walking his, I guess, dog passed, asked us what had gone on, and said, "Welcome to American democracy. It's a full contact sport." So, good line. Anyway, we love America, and I want to see it succeed. But also, purely selfishly, if America does a thing, like if America gets ill, the world catches a cold. If America is the shining city on a hill, as John Winthrop once said, and the leading example that mass deportations are not just a vote winner, but possible, then that means that we can do it too. And it means that we can even bring over American officials to tell us how to do it. So, get a handle on your country so I can get a handle on mine. And I look forward to next visiting when I don't have to go through a passport line that feels like I'm in central Islamabad. Thank you very much.